All right, this chapter that I'm going to read, chapter 11, is called The Miracle. The last chapter was called The Explosion, and if you remember, the goose egg exploded and was very smelly, which caused Avery Arble not to bother Charlotte. And at the end of the chapter, Charlotte was working on something, and we don't quite know what yet. So this chapter is called The Miracle. The next day was foggy. Everything on the farm was dripping wet. The grass looked like a magic carpet. The asparagus patch looked like a silver forest. On foggy mornings, Charlotte's web was truly a thing of beauty. This morning, each thin strand was decorated with dozens of tiny beads of water. The web glistened in the light and made a pattern of loveliness and mystery, like a delicate veil. Even Lurvy, who wasn't particularly interested in beauty, noticed the web when he came with the pig's breakfast. He noted how clearly it showed up, and he noted how big and carefully built it was. And then he took another look, and he saw something that made him set his pail down. There, in the center of the web, neatly woven in block letters, was a message. It said, "Some pig." Lurvy felt weak. He brushed his hand across his eyes and stared harder at Charlotte's web. "I'm seeing things," he whispered. He dropped to his knees and uttered a short prayer. Then, forgetting about Wilbur's breakfast, he walked back to the house and called Mr. Zuckerman. Here is what the web looked like when Lurvy saw it. It says, "Some," and then "pig." "I think you'd better come down to the pig pen," he said. "What's the trouble?" asked Mr. Zuckerman. "Anything wrong with the pig?" "Not exactly," said Lurvy. "Come and see for yourself." The two men walked silently to Wilbur's yard. Lurvy pointed to the spider's web. "Do you see what I see?" he asked. Zuckerman stared at the writing on the web. Then he murmured the words, "Some pig." Then he looked at Lurvy. Then they both began to tremble. Charlotte, sleepy after her night's exertions, smiled as she watched. Wilbur came and stood directly under the web. "Some pig," muttered Lurvy in a low voice. "Some pig," whispered Mr. Zuckerman. They stared and stared for a long time at Wilbur. Then they stared at Charlotte. "You don't suppose that spider," began Mr. Zuckerman, but he shook his head and didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he walked solemnly back to the house and spoke to his wife. "Edith, something has happened," he said in a weak voice. He went into the living room and sat down, and Mrs. Zuckerman followed. "We've got something to tell you, Edith," he said. "You'd better sit down." Zuckerman sank into the chair. She looked pale and frightened. "Edith," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I think you'd best be told that we have a very unusual pig." A look of complete bewilderment came over Mrs. Zuckerman's face. "Homer Zuckerman, what in the world are you talking about?" she said. "Oh, this is a very serious thing, Edith," he replied. "Our pig is completely out of the ordinary." "What's unusual about the pig?" asked Mrs. Zuckerman, who was beginning to recover from her scare. "Well, I don't really know yet," said Mr. Zuckerman, "but we have received a sign, Edith, a mysterious sign. A miracle has happened on this farm. There is a large spider's web in the doorway of the barn cellar, right over the pig pen, and when Lurvy went to feed the pig this morning, he noticed the web because it was foggy, and you know how a spider's web looks very distinct in the fog. And right sprang in the middle of the web were the words, 'Some pig.' The words were woven right into the web. They were actually part of the web, Edith. I know because I have been down there and I've seen it. It says 'Some pig' just as clear as can be. There can be no mistake about it. A miracle has happened, and a sign has occurred right here on earth, right on our farm, and we have no ordinary pig." "Well," said Mrs. Zuckerman, "it seems to me you're a little off. It seems to me we have no ordinary spider." "Oh, no," said Mr. Zuckerman. "It's the pig that's unusual. It says so right there in the middle of the web." "Maybe so," said Mrs. Zuckerman. "Just the same, I intend to have a look at that spider." "It's just a common gray spider," said Zuckerman. They got up, and together they walked around Wilbur's yard. "You see, Edith, it's just a common spider." Wilbur was pleased to receive so much attention. Lurvy was still standing there, and Mr. and Mrs. Zuckerman, all three, stood for about an hour reading the words on the web over and over and watching Wilbur. Charlotte was delighted with the way her trick was working. She sat without moving a muscle and listened to the conversation of the people. When a small fly blundered into the web just beyond the word pig, Charlotte dropped quickly down and rolled the fly up, and careful to get out of the way. After a while, the fog lifted. The web dried off, and the words didn't show up so plainly. The Zuckermans and Lurvy walked back to the house. Just before they left the pig pen, Mr. Zuckerman took one last look at Wilbur. "You know," he said in an important voice, "I've thought all along that pig of ours is an extra good one. He's a solid pig. That pig is as solid as they come." "You notice how solid he is around the shoulders, Lurvy?" Sure I do," said Lurvy. "I've always noticed that pig. He's quite a pig." "He's long and he's smooth," said Mrs. Zuckerman. "That's right," agreed Lurvy. "He's as smooth as they come. He's some pig." When Mr. Zuckerman got back to the house, he took off his work clothes and put on his best suit. Then he got into the car and drove to the minister's house. He stayed for an hour and explained to the minister that a miracle had happened on the farm. "So far," said Zuckerman, "only 4 people on this earth know about this miracle. Myself, my wife Edith, my hired man Lurvy, and you. Don't tell anybody else," said the minister. "We don't know what it means yet, but perhaps if I give some thought to it, I can explain it on my sermon next Sunday. There can be no doubt that you have a most unusual pig. I intend to speak about it in my sermon and point out the fact that this community has been visited by a wondrous animal. By the way, does the pig have a name?" "Why, yes," said Mr. Zuckerman. "My little niece calls him Wilbur. She's a rather strange child, full of notions. She raised the pig on a bottle and brought him home and I bought him from her when he was a month old." He shook hands with the minister and left. Secrets are hard to keep. Long before Sunday came, the news spread all over the country. Everybody knew that a sign had appeared in a spider's web on Zuckerman's place. Everyone knew that the Zuckermans had a wondrous pig. People came from miles around to look at Wilbur and read the words on Charlotte's web. So there's a picture of the barn, and Wilbur's down here in the basement of the barn. All those people are around looking at the web in the corner. I think the web's right up there in the top. The Zuckerman's driveway was full of cars and trucks from morning till night. Fords and Chevys and Buick Roadsters and GMC pickups and Plymouths and Studebakers and Packards and DeSotos and Oldsmobiles and Jeep wagons and Pontiacs. The news of the wonderful pig spread clear up into the hills, and farmers came rattling down in buggies and buckboards to stare hour after hour at Wilbur's pen, admiring the miraculous animal. All said they had never seen such a pig before in their lives. When Fern told her mother that Avery had tried to hit the Zuckerman spider with a stick, Mrs. Arble was so shocked she sent Avery to bed without any supper as punishment. In the days that followed, Mr. Zuckerman was so busy entertaining visitors that he neglected his farm work. He wore his good clothes all the time now. He got right into them, and he got up in the morning. Mrs. Zuckerman prepared special meals for Wilbur. Lurvy shaved and got a haircut, and his principal farm duty was to feed the pig while the people looked on. Mr. Zuckerman ordered Lurvy to increase Wilbur's feedings from 3 meals a day to 4 meals a day. The Zuckermans were so busy with visitors they forgot about other things on the farm. The blackberries got ripe, and Mrs. Zuckerman failed to put up any blackberry jam. The corn needed hoeing, and Lurvy didn't find time to hoe it. On Sunday, the church was full. The minister explained the miracle. He said that the words on the spider's web proved that human beings must always be on watch for comings of wonder. All in all, the Zuckerman's pig pen was the center of attraction. Fern was happy, and she felt that Charlotte's trick was working and that Wilbur's life would be saved. But she, too, found that the barn was not nearly as pleasant. Too many people. She liked it better when she could be alone with her friends, the animals. And the next chapter, chapter 12, is called A Meeting.